So here comes the first light layer, the skylight, and ironically labeled as fake for the reasons that will become clear in just a moment. It should be easy to find, as it's the topmost lighting layer just below the scene folder. We just need to click the checkbox to activate it. There you will find two mesh lights with the emission materials applied to them. They're placed just outside the window frames, really close to the windows. Actually, I can try moving it by selecting these mesh objects and by pressing G to see where it's actually parked. Maybe we'll see it better in the material preview though. So basically that's the set of elongated mesh light objects that for some mysterious reason don't cast any actual light onto the warehouse interior. Thus the fake label. The material is set to emission, as we can see, but no matter the power, it doesn't affect the environment still. No matter what we do with the strength slider, there is no effect whatsoever. The thing is that these mesh objects are meant to be viewed from within the camera only as a way to control the window's exposure. So down within the object properties, I set the ray visibility of these objects in such way for it to show only to the camera, by cutting down the diffuse, glossy and all other rays which are used by cycles to simulate light rays bouncing around. So in this sense, this is a fake light, or fake self-illuminated object, that is still gonna be very useful to have to adjust the sky exposure separately from the scene illumination, let's say. As for the black body node in the color tab, it's probably not really necessary in this case, but down in the light material settings, which can be found in the shader editor, I decided it would be fun to use the color temperature as a fancier way to deal with the light source tint. As we remember, it is measured in Kelvin, and the lower the temperature, the warmer the color, and conversely, the higher temperatures produce progressively cooler tint, which resembles an overcast sky or something. 6200 is close to a neutral white tint, so I don't know why not just go with the default color. It's good to know we can do it this way though. Maybe you'll decide to go with a lower temperature, sunset vibe or something. Who knows? Right away, I'll bring the subject of post-processing into focus by briefly visiting the Compositor tab with the Use Nodes checkbox activated. So, there we have the glare node lingering. See, even though our fake sky doesn't give away any global illumination rays, it still bombards the camera with quite the bright camera rays that can and will trigger a lot of glare if we wish to. I'm gonna give it a quick render so we can see the effect. So, because these sky pixels were really hot, they triggered a lot of glare. That's how we become aware of the dynamic range right off the start with the help of this effect, if that makes sense. It will help us to gauge the dynamic range we're going for, which is gonna be a wide dynamic range indeed. Imagine staring at the bright daylight from the darkness of the warehouse or something. It is an extremely wide dynamic range, it is not a joke. By the way, holding Shift and right-clicking on the sky pixels will show their scene-referred RGB values, which go all the way to 20 in both red, green and blue channels, meaning 20 times brighter than, let's say, a white paper. Just to provide a contrast, the random point on the wall will read as 0.00 something, whatever, 004 for example, which gives us an enormous difference between the darkest and the brightest points in the image. And the glare effect is a way to see that range visually. Alright, that was a brief detour into the Blender Compositor. Now we can get back to the 3D viewport and shovel some real light into our warehouse. In addition to the fake sky panels, just working for the camera, we should place some real ones. So that's what we can do next. I'm going to toggle off the first layer for a moment and enable the second one that says window_light with a real suffix, so we know it's gonna be the real deal. This is also a set of mesh lights, but this time it's the normal mesh lights, the regular mesh lights that do illuminate stuff around them. This is a fundamental light layer from the main light source that exists in the environment, and it's gonna give away a nice, really soft base, as the window openings are pretty big. It's the base of what we can say is our key light. It is the most basic read of form and direction in this scene. And as for the strength, I'll treat it as a base layer indeed, leaving some room for the rest of the lights, keeping it fairly low in terms of exposure for the time being. But anyway, keeping it strong enough so pretty much everything is still readable. That should get the job done for the base lighting layer. As for the ray visibility in the object settings, unlike the fake sky panels, this one has diffuse and glossy rays in place. The cast shadows is turned off for this object though, so it doesn't block the sunlight that we will add shortly, and pretty much all other potential lights coming in from the outside world. This light shouldn't block other lights, in other words. It's not unlike flame that doesn't cast shadows, as we remember. Okay, I'm leaving the camera visibility on for these mesh lights because they'll be placed behind the fake panels anyway. It is hard to see, I think, but the real ones are just behind. So this is it. But thinking of it, why do we have to put these sky panels right outside the windows? Shouldn't it be way easier to just stretch a huge light blanket imitating the sky outside? Wouldn't it be easier this way? It could be a tricky thing to explain, but as we discussed in the previous chapters, there is such thing as the light fall-off, which is based on the distance from the light source to the subject, and which essentially means that the light source placed near and the light source placed far away from the subject have different light patterns. It just falls off more quickly when it's placed near. So yes, of course, technically this skylight could be a large plane with the emissive material somewhere far away, something like that, and it would absolutely work. There is nothing wrong about it. Maybe there will be some extra fill from the directions we don't want, but mostly the difference will be in the light fall-off. Let me try to quickly demonstrate it by comparison. So here is the comparison. I'll leave it up to you to deduct the difference in the light patterns. Here is the sky blanket versus the smaller window lights, just shaped like the actual window openings. I'm going to toggle it back and forth, see how the intensity falls off quicker in the case of the window lights. It's fairly hard to see, but it's there if you look how the floor is darker in the other example. So I think that's why I choose the window sky panels instead of a huge light blanket outside. Basically for a harsher light fall-off, and I guess to control the distribution of light better, so nothing leaks from the left side of the scene and from the back of the scene where we don't have any walls, and so on. So what I find really useful about the split setup with two different window lights, one real and one just meant for the camera, is that we can now control the sky exposure separately without affecting the illumination. For example, we can fine-tune the levels to get a certain level of glare, not worrying about spilling too much or too little light into our scene. One of the main motives of this lighting course, as I see it, is the notion of creative control over every aspect of lighting. Separating light paths like that plays right to this notion. It's just extremely convenient once this mindset is applied. I think it's quite liberating. It frees us to be really deliberate about our lighting choices. With that said, we can move on to the third component of the skylight we are trying to imitate. Now when the basic soft skylight is set, it's a good time to break it up by introducing some details into the setup, hopefully without breaking the base. In the outliner, find the third folder called Windows_light_02, also a fake one. This will be the layer imitating the dirty glass on some of the window panels. Not all of them. The point is to break up the uniform look by stopping some light here and there, leading to less power and less glare in some of the windows. Let's see how it all works together. I'm gonna switch the first 3 light layers on. That's our compound window light, so to speak. Speaking about the materials, the material for this one is once again just a simple emission shader with a strength slightly lower than the main sky material. I didn't want it to be much dimmer than the rest though, just a stop or two less, I think. Basically, I wanted to trigger less glare in post-pro, if that makes sense. Now let's do a quick render by pressing F12 and basically see how it reflected on the levels of bloom. Now, only a few windows emit a solid amount of pixel blooming, as if a really powerful light is punching through. Again, we can right-click on these out-of-bounds spots to reveal that they're peaking at about 20 in red, green and blue channels. These are pretty intensive values indeed. These horizontal slits also remaining quite hot at almost 20. Let's also check for comparison the newly placed Windows readout. Shift right click. It is just 6, which is also quite luminous, but not as luminous as these other hotter parts. As with the other panels, these ones don't cast shadows due to the shadow rays visibility checkbox being unticked. Okay, now with the extra details added, the first major block of our lighting setup should be more or less complete. A decent soft light source that has a good motivation, which is always a pro when it comes to cinematic style. The light from this source feels motivated precisely because we see the source in the shot as a part of the diegetic world. It literally exists within the environment. And in addition to that, it's not just some opening, but it has its own setting and character. It's this rather intricate object with lots of framework breaking up the flow and just looking old and interesting, I guess. In my opinion, aside from simply shaping the light flow, as in casting the shadows and all that stuff, the look of the practical sources visible within the shot really shapes how we perceive the light coming from that source. Like, think of how these two things are connected aesthetically. I think it could be a really interesting subject to dive deeper, not in this tutorial though, but still interesting to ponder on. Alright, after we got the soft skylight working, the next step could be letting some sunlight in. This first part of the compound light source imitating the sun will be the core beam of harsh sunshine. We are still in the blend file from the resources, still in the rendered mode all the time, still using cycles, just as a quick reminder. So we have a bunch of layers related to the sun. Let's toggle the first one on. The sun lamp is placed outside the level. Actually, it doesn't matter where it's placed as it shines from the point infinitely far away anyway, but I find it logical to keep it outside. As for the sun angle, my idea was to keep the setup upstage. In other words, to have all main lights on the background side of the scene, so all shadows fall in our direction, and to avoid that kind of frontal flattening. A super cool technique with the harsher lamps like the sun is to draw the light shapes, or let's say geometric figures with it, treating it in a formal composition sense. It matters where the sun is pointed though, because the shapes will obviously change depending on the sun angle, and some shapes will be compositionally more appealing than others. I generally try to avoid placing the lamps frontally, as we lose some of the inherent light motivation, disconnecting the sun angle from the visible light sources within the scene, aka our windows with the bright sky visible. In addition to that, the frontal setups are often much less three-dimensional than the side or backlit setups due to the fact that everything seems to have less depth when the light is on the camera side. We talked about that extensively in the first few chapters of this course. The narrow versus broad lighting, reversed key lighting and all that jazz. Okay, so I pointed the sun lamp eventually to shine through the windows, throwing the cool shadow patterns on the rear wall, and just creating these streaks of light which add to the value contrast, or the contrast of light versus dark. I find this angle really pleasing, but we can try something different if you wish, for example tilting it in a more acute and dramatic way, which in my opinion might throw the composition out of balance, but still. What I usually do when I have doubts whether the lighting is good for visual composition of the shot or not, is that I make a bunch of renders showcasing different variants, then I pull it all into the image editing software like GIMP, go black and white, and crank the contrast all the way up to focus on the first ridge shapes. It won't hurt to flip the canvas as well to get a fresh look. Then, this more dynamic sun pattern looks fairly cool, I think. I like it, but it's slightly less balanced if you ask me. The sunlit side just overpowers the other side completely. Composition-wise, the shapes that the sun throws are pretty much the V shapes, or the arrow shapes pointing away, we may say. So while I like it, I think this one looks better though. Yeah, I think I just prefer this one, which has a nice balance formed of 3 arcs going around the scene, creating amazing light to dark rhythm, not mentioning the sweet secondary geometrical patterns on the wall. I really like that. I'll surely go with that one. So that is how we can analyze the relationship between the light sources and their contribution to the final image. I think I forgot to mention that the sun lamp is pretty powerful at 45 watts per meter. That is what we expect from such light source, so should be believable. And the angle which controls the blurriness of the shadows is set very low for razor-sharp look. Alright, what I'm gonna do next is go ahead and develop this sun idea into a more complete sun experience. The other thing that is characteristic to the sun as a light source is a brighter patch of the sky around the core, a halo, or how do you call it? It should be softer than the core but still pretty directional, worth imitating in other words. I'll disable the window light for the moment, maybe accept the sky exposure so it's still easier to work with the motivation in place. So the Light Sun 02 collection is our secondary sun lamp imitating the brighter patch of the sky. As you can see, this second sun is not even aligned with the rotation of the main one, but it doesn't really matter as we will see in a moment. Well, it could be aligned, but that's not something we should worry about as it will blend in with other lights. Oh, it's also worth mentioning that it's also less powerful. So what this secondary sunlight gives us is extra gradients and extra complexity, which looks great, even though it somewhat blends into the environment. How soft should it be is totally up to you. I went with the moderately high value in the angle property to keep the beam focused, but blurred at the same time, if that makes sense. That was the second or secondary component of the sunshine. There is a third one though that we will have a look at next. As we've been mentioning throughout the course, gradients are awesome. There can't be enough gradients. Well, there could be, but nevertheless, worth a try definitely. I'm gonna open the light_extra folder, then show overlays. And maybe it will be better to switch everything off just to see this layer better. So basically we have a few point lights outside the window frames near the wall, as if to give this area a global illumination boost. As if the sunlight, is bouncing around or something, in hope that it will help us to squeeze even more fall-off out of this setup once all other sources are on. It is pretty similar to what we did in the monastery dungeon lighting setup, and it will also leave some extra reflections here and there, but I think we can accept it as a feature. So this is our extra global illumination. I think we can think of it in this way. Now with the rest of the sun layers, I think it should look pretty good. That is our sun, basically a compound light source with a harsh and powerful core, the softer secondary source, and the GI boost for extra fall-off on top of it. All of that should look even better once blended into the base light that we had before. Now this part of the lighting setup feels complete to me. That is the second milestone, I think. The first one was tackling the skylight. Okay, before wrapping this mini section up, let's have a look at a quick comparison. Here's the core of the sun, with some softer secondary sunlight added in. This is the effect of the extra point lights. And finally, this is how it looks with the window light that we have set up previously. At this stage of the lighting process, when the basics are nailed, I usually get back in my thoughts to contrast, namely the contrast ratio between key and fill as a major creative decision that has to be made. The point is to nail the final look via getting to the right contrast ratio that looks best and closest creatively to the look we are going for. The Color Management tab has some awesome tools for such sweeping changes, like exposure for example. Crunching down the light values or letting more light hit the sensor affects the contrast ratios among other things. And then it goes through the Filmic View transform and various contrast presets that also play their role in shaping the light values within the image. So that's where we can play with the big changes. We will get to that later on though. Let me reset the exposure to 0. Okay. But for now, I'll keep adjusting the power of the lights. Let's say I want to make the whole thing brighter, so I'm cranking up the skylight as a major source of exposure in this scene. I'm looking for the brighter key lights overall and the brighter image as well, so I'm increasing the strength of this light source by quite a bit. It should be slightly more high key now, which is exactly what I'm looking for. It became quite contrasty at the same time, which tells me that it can probably use a bit more ambient fill, especially the underexposed right wall. I think getting some level there will help with the grungy yet welcoming vibe, if that makes sense. It echoes the stuff we talked about in the Monastery Dungeon chapter. Basically, we can either keep the ambience low and thus achieve a higher contrast ratio between key and fill lights, that is also called low key lighting. Or on the contrary, we can give ambience a boost and work with the lifted base level, effectively reducing the contrast ratio to something like 3:1 or 2:1. It would be the high key lighting in this case, or actually anything in between high key and low key. Applying this to our scene, that's how the low key ratio would look like. As if you stepped indoors from a midday street and haven't fully adapted yet. That sort of thing. And then it could be a mixed bag of ratios for different parts of the scene. A pretty mild contrast of key and fill on the rear wall, but then a few really dim spots elevating the overall contrast. Or it could be a pure high-key lighting with a whole range of bright tones, or at least moving in this direction, let's say. I hope it is clearer now. Personally, I'm aiming for the third and last option here, the brighter tones everywhere, and yet not completely deprived of contrast. So, once all the key light sources are nailed, it is time to balance the overall contrast by filling in shadows as needed. As wanted, rather. There is the fill light collection, which contains our fill light. The fill source is on the opposite side relative to the key light, basically an elongated light strip pushing some extra room tone into the scene. As far as the color of the ambience goes, I gave it a slightly warmer tint to imitate the light bouncing off the brick wall, basically. That should do it. As always, there is a danger of washing out the directional light pattern if the fill light is overdone though. Everything could get flat again, so the fill light would better be used in moderation. Let's try it again. So maybe something like that. I'm just eyeballing it. Looks good though. I also added the bounce object just in case. It doesn't do anything at all right now, to be honest. It's just a plane set to wireframe mode in the viewport to not block the view. The plane that is supposed to reflect some of the light back into the scene. I'm not sure why I did that, honestly. Here it makes practically no sense. Anyway, if we had a slightly different angle for the sun, it could hit that bounce in theory. Just like in the Robo character chapter of the course. The fill light is doing most of the work here anyway. The bounce is just our backup plan. A sleeper cell, essentially. Well, anyway, that is how it would look with a very little amount of fill light. And for comparison, here's the shot with a larger amount of the fill light, helping to balance the overall contrast. Not that the crunchier image is bad by any means. I love going for this style and look myself, but here I feel like a slightly overexposed image with the abundance of bright tones and dampened contrast is the way to go. Awesome. Before we start adding cinematic haze to our warehouse, and before I forget, I wanted to mention what I think about the relationship between lighting and set design. That is something that really intrigues me, and here's why. The lighting itself can be simple, the same thing here and in many other 3D scenes, a skylight plus the sun, and bingo. But then there's set design, all the objects, materials and particles and whatever else that actually catches that light. Imagine this, without all the mess in this classroom scene, the light would just go through, all the way through, and we won't even see anything, because the photons are invisible. We don't see light directly, we see it and appreciate it only if it passes through haze or if it's stopped by the object on its way. It's the intricacy of the geometry that makes any lighting setup work. It is the details we scatter, it is the materials we use, the materials that diffuse, reflect, refract, and transport in any other way the light in the scene, so the scene becomes alive. Like these bottles, the lighting is just an area light, but given the set design, the sheer amount of interesting stuff for that light to pass through and get bent and refracted and stopped, it makes this lighting setup work. Our warehouse environment also has some elements of set design, without which our lighting setup would just not work, like the pipes, the detailed light catchers placed on the way of the sunlight. Or, for example, the puddles. The window light wouldn't be as impactful if some part of it wasn't reflected off the floor, thinking about it, right? Or, for example, the intricate framework. It is curious to think of lighting in such a way to include these set-related things into it. It is the off-topic discussion though, and it ends here. And we are about to get back on track. Back to adding haze to our environment. Haze is a staple of cinematic lighting for sure, an easy win, something that you do and I do, and everything gets more depth and dimension right away. So why don't we do it this time again? In the previous tutorials we used the volume shaders in both Cycles and Eevee, a more or less 3D approach which is physically plausible and mimics the real cinematography techniques like using a fog machine. Let's do it again. The haze collection contains the box, which is filled with the foggy material that scatters and absorbs the light. This box with fog pretty much encapsulates the scene, more or less. Visiting the shader editor, it is our fellow principled volume shader that goes into the volume socket of the material. As usual, it is important that the principled volume output goes directly into the volume rather than the surface output, otherwise the scene just becomes black. What else? The display type for this box is set to wire, so it doesn't obstruct the viewport. The usual stuff. So we can definitely try this approach one more time, maybe with a higher anisotropy perhaps, to make the light beams visible. As the value is close to 0, bring in a bit too much Silent Hill rather than highlighting the sunbeams. Not that I have anything against Silent Hill look. The lower density doesn't really help, that's just not the type of haze I want. So what we can do to help highlight some of the sunbeams is to actually make the anisotropy higher. Higher anisotropy almost hits the mark and looks nice, I think. It creates a pretty interesting diffusion, yet I'd leave this whole thing for the plan B, the real haze I mean. And let's try a different technique that is more fit to controlling each individual beam, even though this technique will be a fake one. Gonna disable our physically plausible fog for the time being and concentrate on the fake technique. The fake light shafts are one of the last, but definitely not the least important things that will help us to sell this grungy location. Let's find the folder called beams_01 and I guess just activate it. To see it better, I will enable the material preview at the top view. So here we go. After doing it, you should see a bunch of transparent planes. each 2D plane having a beam texture. The display mode for each object is set to wire, so we can see through these planes in the viewport. Okay, that is the basic setup. So each plane has a procedural texture, imitating the sun rays passing through a thick medium, but essentially it's just a regular flat plane with 4 vertices. I've scaled it up roughly to the size of the window section, so it's easy to align. I'm gonna show you some knobs of the shader really quickly now, though it won't be an in-depth look by any means. Feel free to explore the material yourself, but here are a few important notes. The basis of the material is really simple. It's the emission shader added to the transparent shader. The resulting mixture is semi-transparent and additive. The strength of the emission shader can be controlled by the strength multiplier here. We can make the beam more or less prominent by tweaking this knob. I won't recommend making it too strong though. Then, if you scroll the material to the left, you'll find this streaking factor. Streaking factor, like its name implies, breaks up the beam by adding vertical streaks or imperfections to it. It's better to keep all these parameters balanced, of course. I won't recommend going all the way left or right in the mix factor. Then one more thing worth mentioning is the color ramp at the top. Where is it? Yeah, I'm gonna rename it as vertical falloff by right-clicking on it. Because that's what it is. It controls the vertical transparency falloff to blend it with the scene in a more gradual way if needed. You can control the falloff by adjusting the flags in the color ramp. Something like that. And of course, we have the color in the emission shader itself. This color should probably correspond with the color of the sunlight, I think. So I gave this slightly yellowish mixture. That's pretty much it for this procedural beam asset. Then I just duplicated it a few times. Notice how the streaking pattern is randomized in each of the objects. And basically I arranged a few rows of these 2D planes to simulate dust and overall haziness with the beautiful light shafts. Just like we mentioned, it is important to keep a cool head and not get overexcited like I often do with the special effects. So moderate streaking and barely visible shafts are definitely the way to go. If you have any doubts, just keep it minimal. That's the safest bet. Imagine bringing in some flavor of the environment just to help sell the whole thing. And by the way, even though these are just 2D planes, I think it looks fairly believable. I wonder if you agree with me here. Let me take a sip. Okay, reducing the strength all the way to 0.03. Cool. A quick comparison here to congratulate ourselves. So here's no beams and haze. Here's how 2D beams look. Pretty convincing, if you ask me. And then we have 2D and 3D solution combined, like someone vaped a lot. And again, just the 2D effect, which I think looks sufficient. And if you ask me, I think it looks gorgeous. Alright, we're almost there. Before we wrap this tutorial up, I wanted to mention color management once again. First, let's render it out to check the glare levels. We will need the compositor, so let's open it up as well. Okay, so the glare. Given the wide dynamic range, overall bright tones and high levels, the glare makes much sense and wraps it up very nicely, making it both realistic and aesthetically appealing. How much glare do we want? It's totally up to you. I'll stick to a moderate amount. Maybe something like, I don't know, 12 to be exact, as the threshold, so only a few areas get a bloom. I'm pressing M to toggle the glare node on and off, and that looks good to me. As a finishing touch, I usually go to color management and see what I can do there to finalize the image. The Color Management tab is both the place where I make big and sweeping changes to the levels and contrast, but also the final touches as well. But whatever we do, make sure that the view transform is filmic and not standard, because the standard view transform just totally ruins the highs. It just rams the highlights right into the clipping wall. It's not fun. It is especially evident at the higher exposures, right? So that is worth double checking. While we are on this page, I'd like to mention a new view transform developed by Troy Sobotka. It's called AGX. First, let's have the filmic looks at the exposure of 1.9, and that's AGX. It performs just as good in this scene. Here's the punchy look applied in the AGX settings, and that is the standard blended transform for comparison. Here's the similar comparison but with the exposure set to 0. That's filmic. That's AGX. That's AGX set to punchy. And finally the standard view transform. Then back to filmic. That's what we're gonna use anyway, filmic. And looking forward to the development of AGX and U1. Make sure to follow Troy Sobotka on Twitter. So that was a short interlude about the Color Management tab and the view transform. And now we can move on to the last section of this video. And this is it, folks. In case you'd really want to fine-tune the look and play with the cinematic potential of this shot, you may use the post-pro node chain we made in the first chapter of the course to tailor it to your liking. Thank you for watching the cinematic lighting in Blender. I hope our course offered some interesting insights into CG lighting in general and Blender lighting techniques in particular. I can't wait to see what you create next. Feel free to share your thoughts and results with us on social media though, and also in the Creative Shrimp Discord students chat. Your feedback is always appreciated, you know. My name is Gleb Alexandrov, take care and stay tuned for the updates.